Welcome to your mock exam debrief. Now, in this video, we're going to go through each part of each question of your mock exam and show you the sort of things that you can have said. We'll give you some exam tips and hints along the way, and we'll also give you the opportunity to mark your own script. Now, before you actually watch this video, you should have made an attempt at your paper. Ideally, you should have had a go at it to time in exam conditions, and ideally, you should have also tried it in a handwritten manner if that's how you're going to do the real exam. Once you've done that, then like I say, you can use this video as a way of marking your script and figuring out how you've actually performed. Now, obviously, this is a big exam paper, so this is going to be quite a long video. Obviously, at any point you need, you can always pause or stop the video and come back to it again later. Now, what we're going to do is start with Estelle Riviere, or ER, which is the big scenario question that you have for 60 marks at the start of the paper. Now, fortunately, we can cut this down to ER, which is a lot easier and faster to say. The main thing that we want to stress to you when you're doing your real exam is you've got this big block of information. You've got this really big scenario, which can be, between 2 and 4 pages long. So to tackle that, one of the best things that you can do is to make sure that you read the requirement first. Now, what that lets you do is it lets you kind of actively read the main scenario. So if you go straight to the requirement before you look at the scenario at all, read it, get an understanding of what it is you're actually being asked to do, then when you start reading the scenario for the first time, you can hopefully try and find bits and pieces of information that you know are actually going to be relevant to what you're going to be answering. So let's have a look at Estelle Riviere's requirements first. We have to analyze the company's competitive position externally using 5 forces and spent. We have to critically evaluate their strategic plan called Beauty Reimagined. And we have to discuss how the company could use AI to help turn its business round. Now, what you can then start doing, and these are just some examples, is pick out bits and pieces of information about the organization that you think might be relevant. So we know, for example, when we've read through the scenario, Estelle Riviere, ER, is founded in 1946. It has a very strong reputation for quality and has world-leading kind of 20 global brands. Now that is potentially going to be quite relevant to things like Porter's 5 Forces, where we look at kind of competition and the industry that this company operates in and how we're managing that. And we know, for example, from the scenario that there's a competitive market. So there are lots of new digital-first companies that are coming in and stealing market share from Estelle Riviere. We can also spot things like, there's high inflation. It mentions information about our suppliers. There's all sorts of bits and pieces of information that you can highlight as you go through the requirement that might be relevant to this first section, this Porter's 5 Forces and spent analysis. We have to critically evaluate Estelle Riviere's strategic plan, Beauty Reimagined. Well, obviously, the key thing within the scenario to read through is to think, well, what actually is this Beauty Reimagined? So because the company has been struggling a little bit financially, they're looking at boosting their social media, maybe cutting their prices, improving their innovation, and particularly focusing on things like sustainability. They're looking at new marketing programs, so less kind of glossy magazine ads. And they're also talking about streamlining operations. So, well, firing a lot of people essentially is what they're talking about doing. So again, that gives us some ideas of what we might start talking about when we get to that part of the requirement. Discuss how the company could use AI to help turn its business round. Well, actually, there's not very much specific information about how ER is going to use AI, but presumably based on the information we know about what the company is trying to do, what it needs to accomplish, we can look at how AI then fits into that. So, like I say, this kind of active reading is really useful and it just sets us up for trying to answer the questions. So once we've had a good read through and we've kind of understood the situation that this company is in, then we can actually start writing our answers or planning our answers at least. And that's what we're going to look at next. So let's move on to the first requirement. So our first requirement, as we looked at before, is to analyze Estelle Riviere's competitive position externally using Porter's 5 forces model and a spent analysis. Now, you'll quite often find that requirements in the exam are like this, that there's more than one thing you need to do. So do make sure that you've spotted all of the models. Now in this case, it's fairly clear what models we need to use. It tells us Porter's 5 forces and spent. Absolutely fine, we can do that. Now, what we then need to think before we start writing is how we're going to structure our answer. So it would not necessarily be a bad idea to have maybe a brief introduction to each model as we're going to use it, or kind of definitions just to say what it is we're trying to do. And then for the main body of the answer, what I would always try and do is try and kind of break it down into sections or headings. Think how you're going to structure it. Now, in this case, we've got two distinct models, 5 forces and spent. And the way that these are structured, we've got, well, 5 forces, so there's 5 things to talk about there, and 5 things within spent analysis. So essentially what we have is 10 separate headings that we need to use here, 10 sections we need to break our answer down into. It's 28 marks, so you're talking about roughly 3 things per heading. Now that's only going to give you a rough idea. You might find you say a bit more under some headings and a bit less under others, but it gives us a rough idea of what volume we need to write, which for an exam of this size can be really useful. The other thing I would think about is just whether the models that you're looking at are likely to suit conclusions. So is there anything that you can briefly conclude on about, in this case, the industry and the macro environment that this company is operating within? So it's always worth taking just a minute or two and thinking about how you're going to structure your answer before you start physically writing it. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty of it then. So let's look at what your answer should include. We'll start off with Porter's 5 forces. So in this case, performing a 5 forces of analysis of this company will help us to evaluate the competitive dynamics in the beauty industry. So essentially, we're just saying here, Porter's 5 forces is all about industry analysis. Now, it doesn't matter what order you've tackled the 5 forces in. We're going to start off with the threat of new entrants. So this looks, if you remember, at the risk of new people breaking into your market and stealing market share from you. Now, the key thing to look at here is really the barriers to entry. So what is it that could act to potentially keep people out of your industry, stop them setting up in competition with you? Now, if we look at the scenario, historically, the barriers to entry have actually been quite high, because there's going to be a very high cost of setting up kind of manufacturing and distribution facilities for all the makeup. You have to have a strong, well-known brand to attract customers. And also, you do need a great deal of technical know-how, because cosmetics and kind of anti-aging creams and things like that, you know, that there'll be very specific things that you need to know about how to do those. It's quite scientific, and presumably you don't want to harm anybody. So you've got to know what you're doing, and having that knowledge and those skills is going to be difficult to acquire. So historically, the barriers have been quite high. The problem that they're having at the moment is that the growth of e-commerce and a shift to businesses coming into the industry and using social media as a way of building their brand has actually made the threat of new entrants higher. It's reduced these barriers to entry. The other reason that there might be some extra kind of movement of companies into the beauty industry is the scenario specifically told you that the market for beauty and cosmetics is growing relatively rapidly. So that will attract new entrants as well, because the market looks like a good one to move into. And it's easy for them to poach customers from you if they do decide to move into the industry, because there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of brand loyalty anymore. Customers are quite happy to kind of connect with new and innovative companies, and they can very easily switch to them. They're not contracted to buy beauty stuff from you, so they can easily just go to any other company that pops onto the market. So historically, the threat of new entrants probably looks like it maybe used to be low, but I think now, yes, there are still some barriers, but it would appear that the threat of new entrants is growing. So it's probably moderate at the moment. Now, where would you get marks from with this one? You'd probably get a mark for just doing a brief introduction to the Porter's Five Forces and saying, it's along industry analysis lines. And then basically you'd get a mark for any other sensible point that you've made. So what we've identified here, you've probably got about 6 marks worth of stuff. So there's 3 marks for identifying what those kind of historic barriers to entry might be. If you've come up with other ones, they might be worth marks as well. And kind of another few marks for talking about the shift to kind of a lower barriers to entry industry, thanks to the likes of social media and the ease of switching. There were marks all available for that. Now, you'll notice here that the points are brief, but they explain themselves. What I would say is normally a sentence or 2 is more than enough to get your mark. So don't say too little. You've got to explain why something would be a barrier to entry, for example, but you don't need to say masses and masses about each one. So you can make your points pretty punchy, so hopefully you can make a lot of them in the time that you have available. Next up, let's look at the power of suppliers. Now, who are ER's suppliers? Well, in this case, it mentions specifically that we source globally. So we have loads of suppliers for our ingredients, our packaging, our fragrance compounds, things like that. So what might impact the power of those suppliers? Well, the key things are really to do with size and scale. ER is a really big company. So you might have spotted the fact that given the fact that we kind of will buy things in bulk from our suppliers, we're likely to be an important customer to them, which gives us a degree of power over them when we're negotiating terms. And on top of that, we buy globally. So we're able to switch suppliers across regions. If one lets us down or we don't want to deal with anymore, for most of our products, there are probably other alternative places that we can source from instead. However, there are some things that give suppliers a bit more power. So for example, there are some of our ingredients that are specialized and that appear to be a bit more scarce or maybe in higher demand. That would raise supplier power because there are fewer places that we can go for those particular raw materials. It's worth noting that actually there is quite a bit of inflation mentioned in the scenario. So that's going to increase our raw material costs regardless of our relationship with suppliers. And also, don't forget, we do have this big push for kind of sustainability and ethics. That might limit our supplier pool a little bit. There are going to be fewer suppliers out there that can provide our products that we need, our raw materials, in kind of an obviously ethical and sustainable fashion. So that might give those suppliers a bit more power as well. So we're really big, but in some of these little more specific areas, the suppliers may have a degree more power. So overall, I think the power of suppliers is probably medium to low in this particular case. Where would your marks come from? Well, again, as normal, 1 mark for any sensible point. So in this example we've got on the screen for you, there's a couple of points we've made about why supplier power would be low, and there's a few we've made about why it might be a bit higher. So any sensible points that you've explained, you can give yourself a mark for. Next up, we have the power of customers. Now, this is basically the same principles as the power of suppliers, but just looked at from the opposite point of view. So how much do we need to worry about our consumers? How much do we need to kind of build them into our strategies? Now, this is a bit of a funny one because, fundamentally, we sell to individual consumers. So while I've not mentioned it on the slides here, there'd be credit available for pointing out the fact that actually each individual customer is only going to buy a very small amount of produce from us, and therefore they're going to be relatively insignificant. Customers don't specifically act collectively either. There's no evidence of kind of cooperatives coming together to buy our materials, to buy our products. And that would also tend to reduce their power. However, in this case, customers seem to be kind of moving their expectations as a whole. So they're not kind of consciously acting collectively, but the market is shifting. And there are certain elements of that that will give them a degree of power. So, for example, they have massive choice across the luxury and niche brands. There are loads of different alternative companies they can choose to buy from rather than us. And that gives them a degree of power. As we already mentioned, and you can get another mark for it here, they have low switching costs, that they're not tied to an individual brand. So they can quite easily move off to a new company or one of our other rivals if they want to do so. And on top of that, the other thing is, and this is kind of what we were trying to say before, they're very sensitive to trends and social media influence. So they may not consciously act collectively, but in reality, they seem to. So large numbers of customers may leave because, for example, an influencer says, "Oh, there's another there's another company that we want you to shop with instead." So there is a degree of kind of collective action here that you get credit for spotting. So in actual fact, ER in this case is in a really difficult position because it does have a strong brand. Now, strong brands will tend to reduce customer power because it makes us unique and makes us desirable. But the problem is, in spite of that, the growth of social media and kind of social influencers have led to people quite easily going out there and looking for more unique products. So in this case, that gives arguably your customers relatively high power. So again, there were loads of ways you could argue this. Remember, this is just an example answer. There were other things that you could have said in here, as we mentioned, but again, you'd get 1 mark for every single sensible point that you made, talking about why customers may have high, or in some cases, slightly lower power. Now, moving into our fourth force, we have the threat of substitutes. So what you're looking at here is first of all deciding what those substitutes might be. Now, it's a broad area, this idea of substitutes. It could be that you've argued that actually a substitute for our premium beauty brands might be non-premium beauty brands. So some of these cheaper kind of mass-produced brands, or some of the newer kind of organic ones, you could argue that they are a substitute to the traditional beauty products that our company and our direct competitors make. So that's arguably a substitute. The other substitute that you could have potentially identified is that a number of influencers are pushing DIY beauty trends. So rather than buying products, people are actually just trying to do things themselves at home using more natural ingredients. So both of those could act as a substitute to our particular products. On top of that, you've got kind of a shift in the market towards this kind of clean beauty, eco-friendly packaging, all the sustainability stuff. And again, that acts as a substitute away from our product. That boosts the idea that people will go to maybe newer brands that offer something that's different to ours and is different to these kind of legacy brands. Now, again, that seems to be the way the market is going, so the threat of substitutes is probably relatively high in this scenario. Now, again, we'll give you kind of a mark for each of those points. Now, you'll notice there are fewer things in this category than we've mentioned under some of the others, and that's absolutely fine. The number of points you need to make under each heading isn't a hard and fast rule. It's a guideline. So if you find that you're saying more things under some headings and less under others, that's absolutely fine, as long as you kind of average out to the right number of points. Now, finally, we come to the threat of rivals, the last of our 5 forces. So this looks at the companies that we directly compete with. So our kind of legacy luxury brand rivals. Okay. The prestige beauty market, very competitive. It's got lots of large global players dominating the sector who have similar sizes to ER. So basically, we're up against companies that are the same size as us and have similar resources. That tends to boost competitive rivalry because we can't easily just defeat them by having better economies of scale than them. What also makes this industry more competitive is the fact that it's not just price competition. all of our rival companies, even in the legacy brands, are being really innovative. They're constantly coming up with new products, new branding, new marketing, new brands, all those different things. So that increases competition and puts more pressure on us as well. And of course, we don't just have to compete with the big players, there are also niche players who also offer kind of high-end premium beauty products, but perhaps have something of a unique selling point by having a better ethical reputation. Now, I know we've made this point already a couple of times, but it's still relevant again here, which is that there are other factors that potentially increase the competitive rivalry, including low switching costs. So again, because customers can easily switch between these brands, that means again we have to worry about losing them to our competitors. We've got to keep an eye on what our competitors are doing. You might also notice the fact that the industry is going to have very high fixed costs. They've got manufacturing costs, R&D, advertising, all these different things, meaning that again, competitive rivalry is going to be increased further because companies with high fixed costs can't afford to see reductions in sales volume. You need a lot of volume of sales to cover those fixed costs. So because of that, again, you worry about what your competitors are doing because you cannot afford to lose customers to them because your profits will start dropping very quickly. And as in this case, the company is already seeing. So pretty much everything in the scenario points to the threat of our direct rivals being really high. Again, there's a mark for every point that you identified here to do with why the threat of rivals was high. So, up to 5 marks at least possible for this particular section. So what we could do quite nicely then is to just round off Porter's 5 forces. So put together a little conclusion about how tricky the market is. Because I think when you go through the 5 forces, you can see this isn't particularly easy. We might not be too worried about suppliers, but other than that, we've got lots of new entrants potentially. We've got lots of pressure from existing competitors, and we've got really powerful, demanding customers. So this could be quite a tricky industry to make a profit in. So any sort of sensible brief conclusion here would get you a mark. Now, that's the first part of this question dealt with. We've done 5 forces. Now, I know it's a huge question, this one. This is nearly a third of your paper, so it's taken us a while to get through. So 5 forces is done. Now we can move on to our spent analysis. Now, remember, spent goes by many different names, so you could see it as pestle or slept or pest or whatever. It's really, you can use whichever one of them you like. In this case, it asked you for spent specifically, so that's the way we're tackling this question. Now, remember, however you do it, spent is all about helping an organization understand its macro environment. So if you've given yourself a little bit of a definition or you mentioned an introduction there about the macro environment, you can give yourself a mark. Once you've done that, then we can go into each of the different stages of spent analysis and think about what we can talk about. So we're identifying any kind of big, wide external issues, non-industry specific, that might potentially impact on our organization. So our first category in spent is going to be social. Now, there are lots of different social shifts that seem to be happening in the scenario that you could talk about here. So for example, it seems that the focus is now on kind of Gen Z and millennials that are dominating beauty consumption, and that's led to changes in expectations. So people are expecting, it mentions things like authenticity and inclusivity, and that might potentially align a bit less with our legacy brand for ER. There's increasing use of social media, which means there's more and more power of influencers. So again, the traditional advertising that ER uses is maybe dwindling in importance. There's growing focus on wellness and self-care. So the demand for skincare and clean beauty products has risen. So there's an opportunity for ER there to tap into that. But there's an importance that then kind of goes to match with what we do. So we need to focus on these, what they call kind of clean beauty lines and skincare focused products to meet those trends. Okay, so basically, however you want to kind of dice this up, there's a shift towards social media, there's a shift towards kind of wellness and inclusion and brands participating in that. And you could probably get a good 3 or 4 marks out of talking about those things. Now, again, how will you get marked for this? Give yourself a mark for each sensible social point that you've identified. Now, you'll notice in the answer here, all the points we've made actually mention ER. Generic, unapplied points will not tend to score. So if you've just said something like, oh, influencers are now important on social media, well, that isn't going to get you a mark because you haven't specifically told me why that matters to ER. So make sure you briefly justify each point as to how it would impact ER for good or for bad. Okay. Again, keep it brief. It only needs to be a sentence or two, but there's got to be some justification as to why it is a relevant point. And you'll see that as we go through all the other stages of spent as well. Next up, we have political issues. So this is anything to do with, well, politics, whether national or international, but also it kind of covers rules and regulations as well. Now, obviously, ER operates globally. That is going to have very obviously some major problems or some major difficulties for a company that deals with beauty products. There'll be all sorts of regulatory requirements regarding, ingredients, safety, packaging, testing, and they're going to be different in China to America to Europe. So that adds a degree of complexity that it needs to be aware of when it's coming up with strategies. As well as the rules and regulations, there's the actual kind of political issues that a company now faces, certainly nowadays, with trading globally. So tariffs, trade policies, economic sanctions in key markets can make it harder or easier, in some cases, for ER to access its raw materials and its customers. Now, you'll notice that's not mentioned specifically in the scenario, but it's something that we see every day in the real world as an issue. So feel free to bring these points in. Something that you know is going to be relevant to a company, again, even if it's not mentioned specifically in the scenario, is still going to get you credit. Now, the other kind of political / legal issue that you could talk about here potentially is kind of the increasing regulation on corporate social responsibility, another thing that we're seeing in the real world very often. So businesses are having to take increasingly strong ethical stances in order to trade in key markets like Europe. Again, we know that ER is committed to sustainability, and that's going to push our prices up in all likelihood because it's going to limit where we can get our supplies from, and that could be quite challenging in the real world given what our customers expect. Again, you can have 1 mark for every valid point that you've made, as long as you've made some sort of attempt to link it into ER. Now, I suspect the E of spent is probably going to be one of the easier ones to look at. It's economic issues, and there are normally these kind of broad standard indicators that we'd look at in pretty much any question. So, for example, you might have mentioned inflation. That's going to increase our raw materials and our packaging costs. Now, given the fact we are a luxury brand, our packaging and our raw materials are probably already relatively expensive. So inflation may push them even higher, which could hurt our margins or mean we need to put our prices up, neither of which might be attractive options. We have seen regular supply chain disruptions, like during COVID-19 or during wars and sanctions and things like that. They can have significant effects on our abilities to meet demand. So that might mean that we struggle, if one of those happens, to kind of meet our production quotas and satisfy demand. Now, again, you might look at that and think, well, is that more of a social point? Is it more of a political point? If you've made it, it doesn't really matter. Don't forget, points can potentially go under different headings. Don't repeat yourself, but as long as they're going under something sensible, you'll still get the mark. Economic downturns or recessions can lead to reduction in consumer spending on non-essential products. So again, ER operates globally. Not every country is going to be growing at the same time. So if countries are experiencing high inflation, cost of living crises, things like that, that puts a lot of pressure on luxury, expensive brands like ER. And the other thing that you could have quite easily talked about here is exchange rates. Obviously, again, if we're trading globally, that means we're going to be buying and selling goods in lots of different currencies. As we get strong or weak currencies in various key markets, you may find that that might significantly impact on our margins, which again could have an impact on our profits and on our selling price to consumers. The natural
logical advancements in skincare formulations like anti-aging solutions. What else is happening in the industry that we might be able to use for ourselves? And that could potentially link back into AI. AI could be used to help us design and develop new products, new ways of packaging them, and collect extra kind of data and information to help us market to our customers. Anything sensible about those would do very, very nicely to get you a mark. So there are a few marks available if you've talked about AI and the different areas that might help. Again, we'll come back to that in more detail later. But also you could look at things like, some people talked about big data in here, which is fine as well. And certainly there were some marks available for discussing social media. So 1 mark for each sensible point.
Now, again, don't forget the easy marks. You've finished a model here. We've looked at spent, so it would be a good idea to do maybe a brief conclusion about the key issues or themes that you've spotted in there. Now, again, keep it short. So in this case, I would say, ER is facing significant external pressure. Society is changing, technology is changing, and that means that it's going to have to come up with some new strategies to deal with that and try and make sure it's still relevant to its core market. Anything sensible that you said there is fine and is going to get you 1 mark for that final conclusion. Now, this first requirement has taken us a long time to get through. It's worth 28 marks, but I was adding them before. Just the things we've talked about there are worth about 46 marks. And it's certainly not comprehensive. There are other things that you could have said in there as well. Now, I just want to stress, you're not expected to say everything that we've just looked at. There may be points in there you look at and think, well, I don't really care for that point. I would never have come up with it myself. That's fine. You don't have to. You don't have to come up with all these different things. You just need to make sure that you're able to say 2 or 3 things on average under each of these different headings, and you would have scored potentially full marks. Okay. The other risk with a question like this, where there's so much you can say, is that people just want to say it all. Now, in reality, you are capped at 28 marks here. So remember, when your time is up, you have 1.8 minutes a mark to do this. When you get to around 50 minutes, that is your time up. So even if you don't feel you've said everything you can say, after 50 minutes, you've probably said everything you're going to have time to say, which means you need to make sure you round your answer off and you move on to the next requirement. So loads of things that you can say here, but like we say, pretty much 1 mark for every valid point. Okay, so finally we can move on to our next requirement, the second part of section A. The requirement here was to critically evaluate Estelle Riviere's strategic plan, Beauty Reimagined. Now, the first thing people tend to do is think, okay, right, what model should I use? And then go into a kind of panic phase when they suddenly think, actually, I can't think what model to use here. Now, in reality, there isn't always a model. Sometimes you just need to chat about something, which I know might seem a little bit scary, but in reality, you can still give this some structure. Now, look at the word here that you're asked to use. Look at the verbs. You're asked to critically evaluate. So evaluate. That means that we need to look at the pros and cons. Okay, so good and bad points. Now, if you wanted to here, by the way, if you wanted to be kind of fancy, you could use SAF to evaluate these strategies. But there are quite a few of them. There's quite a lot within this. So you could use SAF if you wanted to. That's absolutely fine. Or alternatively, you could just use pros and cons. And that second approach is the one that we're going to use here. It does say critically, which means we don't need to be afraid of criticizing and saying where you think they're doing something wrong. Now, how do we actually structure this? Well, to be honest, the question gives us specifically 4 areas within Beauty Reimagined. There are 4 strategy threads in it. So it would probably make sense to look at each one of them one at a time. Now, not everybody did this. If you just came up with a big list of pros and cons about all of them, then that would work as well. You would still get the marks. But I think structuring it one at a time is probably the most sensible thing to do. That also gives an idea of how much to write. So again, we have 4 areas within Beauty Reimagined. There are 20 marks. So you need to say around about 5 things for each one. So, a couple of pros, a couple of cons about each one would get you there, okay, to your full marks. So even if there's not a specific model, there are normally ways of looking at the question and then trying to figure out how to actually pull it into something sensible. So let's look at the first one. We have the idea of expanding consumer coverage. So what ER is planning on doing is increasing its presence in high growth social media channels and markets and media, and also kind of offering potentially some lower priced products. Now, there are definitely some advantages of doing this. They're talking about expanding social media and digital channels. You know from your earlier analysis that that seems to be where a lot of the growth in the market is going. Particularly young consumers are shopping online, they're making decisions on social media, and therefore realistically, it makes sense to tap into that demand. So the fact that it hooks into these high growth platforms, that really is going to benefit the company. So there are a couple of marks available for you talking about that. Now, one of the other things they're doing isn't just looking at social media channels, it's also about reducing potentially or doing some lower price products. Now, that can be an advantage to a company like this as well. Diversifying into more affordable or mid-range products means that ER is going to be able to capture a wider customer base. So as well as hopefully being able to sell to the premium buyers we sell to at the moment, we might be able to tackle kind of lower, more cost-conscious consumers as well. So it broadens our appeal base amongst customers. Cutting our prices could also let us expand into new developing markets, but also it could insulate ER from the falling disposable income in some of its current markets. So in places like the UK, where there's been a bit of a squeeze in people's disposable income, having lower priced products would be an absolutely fantastic idea. So, where are you going to get your marks from? Couple of marks for talking about why it's such a good thing to go into social media. Couple of marks about maybe where the advantages would be of offering more lower priced products. Where are the drawbacks going to be? Well, one of the biggest, I think, drawbacks that jumped out at me with this, with the idea of lower priced products, that it sounds great, but in reality, we are known as a luxury brand. So if you start selling cheap products, there's a risk that your customers will basically look at you and think, well, you're just cheap. So you may end up losing your premium image and then losing those premium customers that make up most of your revenue at the moment. So we could easily kind of erode our prestige value, our brand value, by offering low price products. On top of that, it can be really hard for a company to just practically manage offering different sorts of product like that. So as well as the actual customer perception, we'd need to think about how we market ourselves and how we run our company, because we'd have to find, cheaper sources of raw materials and cheaper production methods and cheaper branding. And to do that while you're also doing luxury stuff is quite confusing for your staff. So there could be kind of structural and decision-making issues that would be problematic if we go about doing this. There are a few marks available there. I think you could get up to a couple of marks for talking about the kind of dilution of the premium image, and you'd get a mark for talking again about the difficulties of running a business that has kind of such very different operations if we've got kind of high-end and low-cost options as well. So you only needed a handful of marks here, but there are a good number of things that you could say about this first possible strategy. Our second part of this strategy was accelerating innovation. So what we're looking at here is focusing on product development across various market segments, so anti-aging, for instance, to meet changing customer demands. Now, that does sound very logical because, again, based on the analysis that we've done, that aligns very well with current consumer demands. Okay, customers want products for specific skin tones, they want broader ranges of different things, they want anti-aging. So that development is what the market is doing. And therefore doing this will help us stay competitive as sustainability, particularly amongst the younger generation, grows in importance. It's worth noting as well, it's by the look of it, it's what everyone else is doing. Innovation is vital in this industry. You can't be seen as standing still because it's fast moving and people's demands are fast changing. So again, competition are going to be doing the same thing and we need to keep up with them. So the idea of innovating goes along with what customers want. It helps us stay competitive and it helps us deal with our competitors who are doing exactly the same thing. The drawbacks are really just around the fact that it's going to be expensive. We're already seeing some strains on our cash flows and our profitability at the moment. So while focus on kind of sustainability is definitely commendable, it's the way the market's going, certainly in the short term anyway, you might find that you end up lowering your profitability because you're dumping a load of money into R&D and into changing, to sustainable products and packaging. The other drawback is, in some ways, it kind of feels like we're a bit late to the market with this stuff. We're talking about becoming sustainable, but in reality, there are other companies out there that are already offering anti-aging stuff and sustainable products, particularly these kind of small new niche players that have come in. So we would need to decide whether, if we go down this path, we're able to actually compete with them. Are we adding anything, or are we going to be able to poach customers back? What would our unique selling point be if we do this? Again, a few marks available for talking through that. One mark for a sensible point, maybe a couple of marks for talking about kind of the cost and uncertainty nature of whether these new products that you're launching would actually work or not. One of the things they're talking about as our kind of third pillar is boosting customer-facing investments. So this is focusing on new marketing programs and getting rid of some of the low return activities like the big glossy magazine adverts. Well, I think basically for this one, again, it broadly makes sense. Investing in digital marketing is basically going where the customers are. We know that most of the customer advertising is now done online and through influencers. So it makes sense, again, that we align ourselves with that. And that's all this is really doing. The other advantage to this really is it's kind of, I suppose these next 2 points are a bit linked. Ultimately, using social media is very, very useful for 2 reasons. First of all, it's a great way of actually gathering data. It helps you connect with your potential buyers, understand what they're actually looking for, and then that will help you develop personalized marketing campaigns. So social media is a great way of not only learning about your customers, but also then using that data to target them personally with things that they might want. So very, very useful for that, much better than traditional advertising. And also, it's cheaper. It's probably going to be a lot cheaper to do social media advertising than it is to do these big glossy printed magazine inserts. So again, that is going to be good for a company that at the moment is maybe struggling a little bit financially and is trying to boost its profit margins. And it means you've got more money to invest in things like R&D. So again, a few marks available for pros there. I think the main drawback is likely to be kind of what people expect from this brand. It's a traditional legacy brand, and you'll probably find a lot of its current customers have connected to it through its traditional forms of advertising. So there is a chance that if you just move to online advertising, you'll lose sales to your current core market. So particularly maybe legacy or older customers who might be less likely to be online, if they're not seeing your glossy magazine adverts anymore, you might find that they lose interest in you. So I guess what we're saying here arguably is that the company maybe needs to balance this a bit. Instead of just withdrawing from these kind of glossy magazines and the traditional advertising routes, maybe it needs to adopt a hybrid approach and do a bit of both. So again, marks available for talking through that. It's probably also worth mentioning here that while it talks about kind of doing online marketing programs and developing new marketing programs, it's not very specific about them. So things like using influencers seems to be really important, and there's no discussion in here of how or if we would do that, and yet that is something that would be quite important. So it feels like there's maybe a bit of this model that's missing when it comes to the strategy. Our final one, I think, is probably the easiest to talk about, and this is the streamlining of operations. Now, that streamlining in the real world and in the exam is probably very obviously code for we're going to fire a lot of people. So what they want to do is simplify all of their structures, so reduce the levels of management and get rid of about 7,000 jobs. Now, there are some significant pros to doing that. We're talking about simplifying the structures so decisions can be made faster. That is a good thing in a fast-moving industry. So we're looking at an organization that's in beauty, which, as we mentioned and as we know, is really innovative and fast-changing. So being able to react quickly to that is good. So simplifying structures and fast decision-making is a good thing. And you are going to end up, if you get rid of 7,000 people, probably saving money. So that's going to give you more cash to A, make you look good to shareholders, and B, gives you more cash that you can invest in things like innovation, R&D, and marketing. So there are advantages to this, and you'd get a good couple of marks for talking about them. The drawbacks, on the other hand, first of all, don't forget, if you get rid of 7,000 employees, that's going to make your remaining staff nervous. You might see a loss of morale. So that could potentially reduce your efficiency as an organization. And also, the public is kind of looking at companies and expecting them to act ethically and responsibly. If you're not doing that, if you fire 7,000 people, you might find that doesn't build the image with your customers that you would like. The other problem with getting rid of so many people is that it means that you're likely to lose knowledge. So things like marketing and R&D, if you're losing key staff members within those areas, then there's a very real risk it will damage the company. So what we're really saying here is that while streamlining could give you these kind of immediate cost savings, if you focus more on cutting jobs rather than improving efficiency, or you cut the jobs in the wrong places, you might find actually you're going to harm the company in the long term rather than benefit it. So again, a good few marks available for talking around those areas. So again, you've looked at these 4 different strategies. Your idea then would be to give yourself a conclusion, because it makes sense here. We're asked to critically evaluate it. So what do you actually think of the plans that they're suggesting? And again, what you say here is, it doesn't really matter as long as it makes sense. You come to a different conclusion to me or to this model answer and still get the marks. But you certainly do need to conclude if you're evaluating something. So in this case, I would argue that actually a lot of their strategy makes a lot of sense here. They're talking about moving more online, focusing on sustainability and innovation, and all of those things are good. Even some of the downsizing might be sensible because it will free up cash and arguably make them kind of more rapid when it comes to decision making. But there are very real risks in how it is actually done. So getting rid of the wrong people could damage the business, for example. The fact they don't mention influencers worries me a little bit. So the detail isn't really there, and there are potential problems. So broadly, I would say it's a good idea, but with some areas of concern. Okay, couple of marks available for any sort of sensible conclusion. Again, keep it relatively brief, just 2 or 3 sentences will be more than enough, and that will get you the marks that you're after. Now, again, we've said loads here. We've talked through loads of different issues, and there are different ways of structuring this answer, as we talked about before. So the key is getting the points down. So however you've structured it, as long as you made sensible points about these strategies.
So our third and final requirement within section A, it's taken us a while to get here, but we're getting here, is discuss how Estelle Riviere could use AI to help turn its business around. Now, again, there's obviously a technical concept in here, which is artificial intelligence, but there's not really a model. This is another one where really what we're looking for is a discussion and an understanding of how businesses like this one could use AI. So we want a brief introduction. So, what is AI? That will probably get you some credit. So if you've done a brief introduction to AI, just a sentence or so, give yourself a mark. What I would say though is read the question carefully. What it's asking you is, how could it use AI to help turn its business around? Now, we know what it needs to do. We know the things that are important to this company from the analysis we've already done. So really what we're trying to do is bring that concept in. So we know that to turn the business around, it needs to develop new products. So, it needs to focus on its R&D and the kind of the new areas that people are interested in buying products with it. We need to boost customer service and boost customer loyalty because we're losing customers to these new kind of hip brands online. We need to reduce costs potentially as well because we're loss making. And we know that we need to become more sustainable because that seems to be kind of the direction of travel for us and the industry as a whole. So you can almost use what you know about the business to create a structure to look at the different ways that AI can benefit the business. Now, the other thing that I would really be careful of here is again, to make sure you have read the requirement really carefully. It's asking you essentially, how can it use AI to help turn its business round? So it's not asking you for a critique. It's not asking you for the problems with AI, of which there are millions. It's just asking for you, how would you use it to benefit the company? So that's a really important little focus. So if you look at your answer and you've done loads of negatives, you're not going to get negative marks, but you're not going to score anything for those. So let's think about some of the areas that you could use AI to help this company. Now, there are actually loads and loads of different ways you could do this, and we're not going to talk about all of them here. Anything sensible is going to get you some marks. But in theory, AI could potentially be hooked into almost any part of this organization to try and improve it. So some examples we'll just talk you through here. Like we said before, one of the key things we need to retain and attract customers.
AI-driven kind of marketing and personalization will be very useful here. Remember, AI in some ways is sort of just an extension of big data. It gathers information really well about trends and customers and what's going on in the real world, and then it can very quickly and easily provide kind of pinpointed marketing for those individual customers. So what we could do here is we could use AI to analyze customer data and create personalized product recommendations really easily, could be hooked into their social media. And actually we could also use it as this kind of big data analysis thing where we use it to predict trends using social media analysis. So it would really help not only like find customers, but it would also help us hopefully improve our relevance with those younger audiences that we need to tackle and kind of tap into. So again, you kind of 3 or 4 marks for each of these, as long as you discussed it and your focus was on how it would actually help and how it would be used. Okay. Next up, you could have talked about AI in product innovation. Essentially, we know we have to spend a lot of money trying to develop new products. Well, AI will help you with that. So it can not only help you streamline the R&D process, but also it could actually be used to help create products. So if you feed it enough information, it should be able to help design new products, or at least support you designing new products. It can also assist in testing and just generally speed up the time to market. So ultimately, you could see that AI would improve innovation time. It would make things faster. It could create new innovations, and it would probably increase your success rate. Because again, you can link that back to the marketing we looked at before. AI could potentially be there to help identify what the best new products are that the market actually wants. So loads of different ways that you could tackle this. Again, kind of 1 mark for a sensible point, up to a maximum of around 4. We could look at optimizing our supply chain and our inventory management. So we know that we have potential issues with some of our raw materials. We source from loads of suppliers all around the world. So again, what we want to be able to do ideally is make that purchasing and sourcing process as effective as possible. So it could predict raw material shortages, it could predict price fluctuations, it could help us make sure we always have enough units in stock based on things. It could help us shop around quickly for new suppliers. It could optimize our global logistics so we don't waste as much. It could identify problem areas within our processes. It could improve supplier selection based around sustainability. It's a great tool for kind of managing pretty much your entire procurement and value chain process. So again, anything you've talked about in there to help you lower your costs, boost your sustainability, or just improve your resilience against all the shocks that seem to be going on in the real world at the moment would get you a mark. You could also push AI into actual physical customer interaction. It's not just about kind of getting their data out of them. It could also be about how you could use AI to actually literally communicate with your customers. So you could have virtual tools. You could, get people to virtually be able to try on different shades of makeup and things just to see what it would look like on them to kind of boost demand. You could have chatbots and things like that to help deal with questions and queries and give advice. Almost kind of make an electronic influencer to a degree. That might work quite well as well. Again, it enhances engagement, it makes you stand out a little bit more in the market, or at the very least do what everybody else is doing, and hopefully what it'll do is increase your conversion rates. So you've got more people that are likely to be trying to kind of come in and buy your products because they've kind of understood them more and they've been convinced by the tools that you've created. So again, few marks available there, 1 for any sensible point. Like I say, this isn't comprehensive. You might have suggested AI in other areas as well, but as long as you made sensible points about how you could use it and why it would be beneficial, you can get marks for that as well. So in this case, again, let's go back to the idea of our overall conclusion, a nice brief conclusion about the key issues. I think for this one, AI is potentially a huge winner. Probably even more so than firing 7,000 of your staff, if I'm honest, because it helps you tap into that engagement with the customer. It's fine to say, oh, let's go on social media, but that doesn't necessarily mean you'll attract customers. AI will help you shape your your product design, it'll shape your marketing, it'll shape your interactions with customers, and hopefully that will deal with a lot of the problems that this company is facing. Again, a mark available for that. So we've covered a huge amount, which is why we're coming up to about an hour on this video. Again, we have talked through so many more points than you actually needed to make. And like I say, it still isn't necessarily comprehensive. These are just giving you areas that you can mark on. But hopefully it will have given you a good idea of how you've performed and also how you should have tackled this sort of paper. Now, that's our A section question done. So we've done that giant scenario. What we're going to go on to do is have a look at the B section questions and get a feel for how you might have tackled them. So we're going to leave Estelle Riviere and the world of beauty behind us, and we're going to move into our B question, our first B question, which is Bird Inc. Now this one is focused around stakeholder analysis primarily. So let's take a little look. Now we're going to do exactly the same thing we did before, which is we're going to read the requirement first. Now, as we mentioned, it is kind of linked around stakeholder analysis. So as to analyse the power and interest of 4 key stakeholder groups in Bird Inc. in the light of the newly elected administration's decisions. Evaluate the impact of the changes on each group for 20 marks. Okay. So again, we'd read through the scenario and get a feel for what it is then that this company is doing. So what's happening? What's the situation? So we're a car manufacturer in country B. A lot of our employees live in countries B and the nearby country C, but there's a new government that's come in country B, our home country, that is looking, is kind of worried about the movement of people and kind of unregulated trade over the border. So it's thinking about potentially kind of making the border less easy to cross. So the board of our company is considering whether it should switch to other suppliers outside of country C or basically just what it should do. Now, the question is really clearly leaning into Mendelov's matrix, the power, interest, and stakeholders. But you need to be really careful here because, again, it's easy to answer a question that's not really the one that's been set. You're asked to analyse the power and interest of the 4 key stakeholder groups, fine. But what it says is it doesn't want to know what the approach should be to managing each of them. It wants you to just evaluate the impact of the changes on the group. So what this country sees government is doing, what impact will that have on the different stakeholders? So you're not being asked, keep informed or keep satisfied or key players. That's irrelevant. That's not what you're being asked for. So be really careful with these requirements. However, we can still think about the structure here. You are asked for 4 stakeholders, so there's no point doing more than 4. It's 20 marks, so you are looking at about 5 marks per stakeholder. Now, there'll probably be, a couple of marks available for the power and interest bits because they're normally relatively straightforward, and there'll be a few marks available for then discussing the impact of the changes on that particular group. Okay, so that's probably how we're roughly going to slice and dice the numbers down, and it gives you an idea again of how much to write. Now again, there are loads of different stakeholder groups that you may have chosen, that there aren't a correct 4 to pick from. We're not going to go through every single possible option because we would be here for hours. What we're going to do instead is we're going to focus on 4 of the most perhaps obvious ones. But if you've done other groups, that's fine. As long as you've explained them and you've kind of tackled them correctly, you are still going to get the marks. So let's look at the management and the board of directors first of all. They are going to be impacted by the changes that the government is making to that border. Now, their power, what is actually happening from a corporate point of view in this scenario is very high. Because if we're looking at what the company should be doing, they control the strategic direction of the company, the investment decisions, any restructuring. They can shift sourcing, they can relocate production. So basically they control the company's response to what the country is actually planning on doing, what the government is doing. The level of interest is likely to be very high because the potential change to the border is going to have a massive impact on the way the business is run. So they're going to have to put in an awful lot of time and work trying to figure out the best way to deal with this problem. So whether to actually change suppliers and move to a different country or whatever. And of course, it could well affect the sustainability, the going concern, or the profit margins of the company that they work for. So that potentially there's a risk there to their pay and job security if things go wrong. So the chances are they would have a very high level of interest. So what's the impact on them likely to be? Well, essentially, there's going to be pressure on them to very quickly try and redesign their supply chain away from country C, which is what we're already seeing. And there's likely to be a short-term fall in profit margins due to the restructuring costs. Potentially, it could even be a long-term one if they're unable to really change their supplies to anywhere with a comparable price. So that, again, like we said, there could be potential pressure on their jobs, pressure on their rewards as well as a manager or a board of directors if that's tied in to success of the company. The marks, again, you're going to get a couple of marks for explaining about power if you've gone into depth. You wouldn't get a mark just for saying it's very high. You'll get a mark for each point where you've justified yourself as to why it's high. Same for interest. They'll have a very high level of interest in what the company does and the fact that the government has done this. Again, a mark for a sensible explanation of why. And the impact of it on them, again, anything sensible will get you marks. Couple of marks for them. Again, 1 mark per explained impact. Next up, we have the government of country B. Okay, so the government of our home country. Now, their power in this situation is going to be very, very high again indeed. They have the power to enforce the new border and the immigration policies. So Bird Inc. is just going to have to run with that. Okay, so that they have immense control to a degree over Bird's activities because they can cause this kind of blocker, if you like, in the border that they rely on. Their interest appears to be very high. This seems to be one of the key things that's on the government's radar at the moment. They're concerned about controlling immigration and reducing illegal goods. So this is clearly an area that they feel is important enough to legislate for and presumably keep an eye on. The impact on the government of this, well, it depends. Ultimately, they've got a bit of a balancing act here. The government has to be able to enforce the new policies. It has to make sure that it's popular with local residents, but it also has to make sure that it doesn't cripple local business. So it will be trying to achieve its goals, but without actually either upsetting the public or upsetting companies too much that it relies on. Again, couple of marks if you've sensibly explained each of those points. Next up, probably one of the more obvious ones we have here is employees. Now, their power is likely to be medium, I would say, for this one. You might have argued this. Don't forget, there isn't really a right answer as such. The reason I thought this one was medium is because they are essential for production continuity. But there's no evidence that they bargain collectively. There's no evidence that they have individual kind of extra special skills that make them really powerful. So you need them. They are important. And losing a load of them could well be very disruptive. But whether they've got actual direct power or not, I think is debatable here. Their interest, though, for a lot of them is likely to be very high. Because ultimately, again, it could impact on everybody's job security if the company struggles because it can't get goods in, it can't get the raw materials in. That could put everybody's jobs at risks. But also the fact that half of your workers actually come from over the border in country C, they would be directly affected by new restrictions. So they might be worried that actually they're not going to be able to get to their job and they're going to lose their work. So they're probably going to be very interested in what's going to be done here. Now, the impact on them, again, depends. Like we said, employees in country C are probably going to have the hardest time of this because ultimately they're the ones that will have to try and travel into the country with the new restrictions in place. However, there's also issues we have, like we mentioned before. You may find that it has broader issues for work at Bird Inc. If they are unable to source cheap supplies from elsewhere or it puts their costs up, you may find that they have to make some staff redundant to maintain their profits. So in actual fact, this is a potentially negative impact for both of those groups of people. So the next and final group we're going to look at is suppliers, specifically suppliers in country C. Now, Bird is a major customer of theirs. It mentions that they are a major importer of car parts from country C. Now, what that means is, again, the level of power of those suppliers is probably medium. It's debatable. You could have gone either way on this one. Suppliers are clearly important to Bird Inc. because they need them. You need to buy these parts for your production processes. However, they appear to be potentially smaller than us. We are a major buyer, and that makes it sound like actually, they need us more than we need them. So it may be that our company is able to quite easily go off and just buy these supplies from other countries, which seems to be what the managers are suggesting we do. Now, if that's the case, again, that means that that the power is with Bird rather than the suppliers. However, it does mention that we have long-standing contracts with many of these suppliers in country C that could be very difficult to break. They may end up giving kind of that group extra power. So you can kind of argue this from different angles. So I've kind of gone somewhere in the middle and said medium. Next up, we've got their level of interest. I think with this one, again, it's going to be high. The reason I think it's going to be high is because the suppliers, again, like we said before, in country C seem to be fairly dependent on Bird Inc. as a customer. They are a major customer of theirs. So any restrictions or changes on those kind of cross-border trade issues could potentially affect their ability to deliver parts and materials on time. So it could significantly cause them issues. It's potential really here that Bird could potentially leave and go with someone else, and then they could end up with this huge kind of gap in their order book. So the impact, just to summarise, your suppliers are likely to face extra costs, extra difficulty getting things over the border. That's going to potentially either reduce their margins or force them to push those extra costs onto Bird Inc. And there is a very real risk that Bird Inc. could just leave and go with alternative suppliers elsewhere, which could be devastating for these organisations. Again, a couple of marks each for answering each of those parts. Again, I think this is an area where you could do a brief conclusion for a mark. Ultimately, Bird Inc. is in a really difficult position. It's got a lot of important stakeholders here that it needs to keep happy, but ultimately it doesn't have any control over whether the border is tightened or not. So there are lots of groups that are going to be potentially affected by it, many of them negatively, but there may be a limit to how much it can do to actually manage that. So in this case, you'd probably get a mark for that. Like I said, there were other stakeholders you could have mentioned, the government of country C, customers, people like that. So any others that you mentioned would have been absolutely fine as well, as long as you, again, were able to make some sensible suggestions for their level of power, level of interest, and what the impact on them might actually be. And that is our second requirement. That's our first B question. And finally, I feel like we need a drum roll. We have our last question, which is question B2, which is City FC. So this time we're focusing on a football club. We're going to tackle this really exactly the same as we have with everything else, which is we're going to read the requirement first. So this one is quite clearly linked into ANSOF. So categorised with a brief explanation, the 4 ideas for expansion according to ANSOF, and for each one, advise the board of City FC on how it could be achieved. So again, when we read this scenario, we discover we're kind of a top-level football club, and we want to build links with local communities. Well, want might be a strong word. We're being pressurised into it by our shareholders, and they found 4 options for doing this that they want you to talk through. Now, again, this is clearly leaning into ANSOF's matrix, just like the last question was kind of leaning into Mendelov's matrix. A lot of matrices for you here. So we're still looking at the kind of new existing products and new existing markets, although this is perhaps a bit more service-based. But you're also asked about how it could be achieved. So what you're looking for here is just some, again, really anything logical about the practical issues that will be involved with implementing that particular strategy and how it could be dealt with. So how could City FC actually manage these strategies? How could it accomplish them? Now, when you read through the scenario, There are 4 possible strategies, and again, it's 20 marks, so we're looking at 5 marks per strategy. You'll probably get a few for explaining the position on the matrix, and then there'll be a few marks for how to potentially do it. So the first of the 4 strategies they're looking at is setting up a chain of coaching schools for young people under the City FC name. So that will be a great way of kind of getting your brand out there and interacting with the community. Now, your first job here is to categorize it. Now, you could argue with this one, and again, some of these are debatable, so as long as you've been logical, you will get your marks. But I would argue here this is probably product development, because you're offering a new service. At the moment, you just kind of play football matches for people to come and view. So you're offering a new service, which is this kind of coaching education to City FC's existing football fans. So you're only going to be pulling people in here for kids that actually probably already watch your games and are already fans. And it's only really in the current regions that you're thinking of offering this. So City FC is really just extending its brand into a new educational area, but it's still targeting people that are already interested in football. Explaining kind of where it goes on the matrix is going to give you a good couple of marks. The key issues then with implementation can really be almost anything you want. How is it going to go about doing this? I mean, there are loads of different ways or loads of different things you could consider. So, for example, where are you going to open these places? How are you going to brand them? So do we launch City FC branded academies? So again, you build on your own brand. That probably makes sense than trying to launch a different brand name. You could use your existing coaching staff and former players as trainers if you could, to keep costs low. Although, again, you could argue that might be impractical because they'll be busy and therefore you'll need to go and hire new people from scratch, which could lead to relatively high costs. How do you actually attract your students to this? You could partner with schools or local football associations. You could advertise at your matches to try and encourage people to take this up. And if it needs to be kind of self-sustaining, look at the finances. There's probably going to be a limited amount of money that you have to spend on this, so you could think about how you kind of create a subscription service, how you charge fees, or whether you can actually kind of link this and your main club together. So use this as kind of a talent scouting pathway to pick up the players of the future and therefore benefit your club in the long run. So those aren't the only things that you could have talked about. You could have discussed locations, kind of marketing, all these different things. It just wanted you to think about, look, okay, you've classified it. How would you do it? What are the issues? What are the practical ways that you would put this in place? That was all the question was asking you to do. So that's our first strategy. Like I say, 2 for classification, and then 4, 6 marks for each one, depending on how many of these points you were able to discuss. Next up, we could open shop selling City FC merchandise in countries B and C. So currently we only operate in country A and online. Now, I think this was a more clear categorization under Ansoff. It's the existing product, so it's our merchandise, but we're selling it in new geographic markets. So we're targeting countries B and C. So a couple of marks available for that. The key issues are really just how you go about doing this. You could just open shops yourself in countries B and C. That's entirely possible. So that would attract customers, certainly. All the money would be yours, but there would be quite a lot of fixed costs involved with that. So that could be quite expensive. Or we could partner with local sports retailers in those countries for distribution. You'd have to maybe share the costs. You might not kind of get as much profit from that, perhaps, but it would certainly be a cheaper, lower fixed cost way of getting your product into those countries without having to go to the effort of building up your own infrastructure. You could use pop-up stores. You could try and just target kind of your digital sales into those countries. So rather than opening anything physical, just look for ways of having country B and country C transactions or websites that you could try and target your fans through there. So there are, again, all sorts of different ways of doing this. These aren't the only things that you could talk about, but just what are the practicalities of doing that?
Our next strategy is to give out grants to grassroots football teams to enable them to buy equipment and kits. Now, again, obviously, we have to decide where this is going to go in Ansoff's matrix. But as with pretty much anything in this paper, it's flexible. So what's important is that you decide how to explain yourself and how to justify your point. So I think possibly the safest one here is that it's sort of an idea of market penetration. You're still basing it around kind of football and what you do with that. So it's sort of an existing product, but it's being targeted to your existing supporters. So very much kind of existing markets, existing products. However, you could also argue that we're talking about giving out grants here. So is that perhaps a new product? In which case you could be looking at product development as a way of engaging with the community, with your existing market. Now, I think it probably is existing market, but how you want to argue it the other way, it is really down to you. So as long as you've justified your position, you can have a couple of marks. What are the practical issues with implementation? Well, again, there is so many different things that you could talk about here. How do you actually go about doing it? So creating some sort of community fund. You'd probably want to slap your brand name on it, I imagine, just so again it's recognizable and also so it's trusted. So people believe that there's a good chance that they'll be able to get something out of it and it benefits you as an organization because, again, your name is attached to something good. You could talk about the sort of things that it would be based around, so what you'd be getting financial grants for. You could look at how you use it practically, so maybe the need for digital applications. You could talk about the practicalities that you have that are necessary to do with kind of employing more staff, because obviously you'll need to oversee this. They'll be, checking up to see whether it's been spent on the right things. There's publicizing success stories. There's all sorts of just practical things. Now, like I say, there's no specifics. We've just given you some ideas here. As long as you made a sensible point that is actually realistic and applies into the creation of this strategy, then again, there's up to 2 marks as long as you've explained it. So 1 for kind of identifying something sensible and 1 for kind of explaining and justifying why it's a relevant point for this particular strategy. Now, we finally made it to our last strategy, which is to allow the City FC Stadium to be used for other purposes out of the football season, for example, concerts and festivals. Now, to be honest, it's kind of up to you how you want to justify this. Again, it doesn't really matter what you've come up with as long as it makes sense, because there's flexibility in how you analyse this. So you could, for example, argue that it's diversification, because we are looking at a new market, which is entertainment, and potentially you're looking at kind of a new product that you are offering to people. Okay, so you've got all these different things that people that are not necessarily football supporters are going to come and see, and you'll make money from that. But alternatively, you could argue that it's actually your existing product, it's your stadium. You're just targeting that to a different demographic. So is it not really market development? The answer is it doesn't really matter. It's debatable. The key, as with pretty much everything in all of these exams, is making sure you explain and justify yourself. So again, a couple of marks available for that. And then finally, we have kind of the key implementation issues. So again, just think about how you'd go about doing it. You probably, as a football club, don't have the skills to put these events on yourself. So I'm guessing you're probably going to have to partner with an event organizer, concert promoters. You're not going to have the infrastructure to do most of this yourself. You could look at kind of legal health and safety requirements. You're using your stadium in a different way to normal. Think about how you can actually use this to perhaps drag in more customers for your normal events. So can you advertise and kind of big up your football events for the entertainment events and vice versa? So you could cross-sell to the different groups of people that are using your stadium. Again, any practical points at all, as long as you explain them briefly, would get you credit. So like we said before, 2 marks for suggesting what the Ansoff approach is, and a couple of marks for any relevant point that you've explained to do with the practicalities. So that's the last of the 4 strategies that this company had considered putting together. Now, the last thing I would say is, with Ansoff's matrix, this is a classic one where you would probably want to conclude, because essentially they've given you 4 possible strategies here. Now, remember, with Ansoff's matrix, if you want to, you can actually do all of them. So what you need to do is have a little bit of a think about how to pull this together to try and come up with, what should this company actually do based on these 4 strategies. Now, there isn't a specific conclusion that will get you a right answer here, as long as it makes sense to what you have said. So I would say with this one, there's no real reason that the football club can't actually do all 4 strategies at once. But it is going to need to bear in mind that it probably has, finite resources. We don't look at cash flows or profits in this scenario. And obviously, each of these may well require money, management time, all these different aspects, which we don't really have any information on. So given the fact we just need to make sure that they're financially viable, ultimately all 4 of these strategies seem like they're things that could be a great way of engaging with the public and other stakeholders, and could be a great way of earning more money from the club as well. But like I say, a couple of sentences will get you a mark just to round things off. And that's it. So that is our review of the entire paper. Hopefully you found it useful. Like I say, the problem you have, or not the problem, but the interesting thing that you have with these papers is always that ultimately there isn't a right answer. As long as you've justified your points, you will get credit for them. So hopefully this kind of whistle-stop tour of it will have given you some ideas when you're marking your script and giving you some ideas for kind of how you can answer questions in the future.